Marlon Brando lived to be 79 years old and was two different men for most of his life. The Marlon Brando the public saw: rebellious, heterosexual, womanizing method acting genius, and the real Marlon Brando, bisexual, fragile, a man struggling with identity crisis. This dual life began in the 1940s as Brando rose to prominence on Broadway, because in those years, homosexuality in Hollywood and American society was not only taboo but also a legal crime, a career-ending scandal, and tantamount to social suicide. As a young man discovering his identity, Brando realized he was attracted to both men and women, but he couldn't share this truth with the public because the man who played Stanley Kowalski, that testosterone-fueled wild masculine man, couldn't be bisexual, or everything could collapse. So Brando put on a mask and never took it off for 50 years. His public relationships were always with women. He married 3 times, had 11 children, and the media portrayed him as a womanizer. But his private life was completely different. He had male lovers, long-term secret relationships, and one of the most important among them was Richard Pryor, because Richard was not just a lover, but also a soulmate, someone who understood him and fought his own battle of living a double life. Brando and Pryor's relationship began in the mid-1970s, when both were at the peak of their Hollywood careers. Brando had become a legend again after The Godfather, and Pryor was America's most famous comedian. Both were married, both were known publicly as heterosexual, and both were hiding something inside. They met at a party, a Hollywood gathering in Beverly Hills, and the chemistry between them was instant because they saw in each other the unmasked reality, the vulnerability, and the longing for freedom. When their relationship began, they were very careful because paparazzi were everywhere. Rumors spread quickly, and a single photo or witness could end everything. Their meetings were late at night, at Brando's mansion on Mulholland Drive, doors locked, curtains drawn, and completely isolated from the outside world. On those nights, Brando and Pryor weren't just lovers. They were also best friends, therapists, and each other's only true refuge, because within those 4 walls, they could take off their masks. When Richard Pryor confessed the secret to his wife, Jennifer Lee, on his deathbed in 2005, a bombshell was about to explode. But the world would have to wait 13 years to learn about it, until Jennifer finally spoke up in 2018 and Hollywood's biggest 50-year-old secret was revealed. If these kinds of secret Hollywood stories interest you, please remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Now I'm telling the full story of Marlon Brando and Richard Pryor's secret relationship. Marlon Brando was in his 20s when he first began questioning his sexual identity, studying method acting at the Actors Studio in New York. Those were formative years as he was discovering his identity both as an artist and as a person. At the studio, he formed close friendships with other young actors, some of which were platonic, while others went deeper. Brando realized he felt attraction not only toward women, but also toward men. This discovery surprised him, but also frightened him, because in 1940s, America, homosexuality or bisexuality meant social suicide. It was a crime in many states, classified as a psychological illness, and impossible to live openly in public. Even within the actor's studio, the subject was taboo. Everyone knew that some actors and directors were gay or bisexual. But no one spoke openly because the McCarthy era was approaching, and any kind of difference was associated with communism. Brando had his first serious male relationship during those years, and the person was Wally Cox, a young comedian and actor. Cox and Brando's friendship lasted for years, and the public saw it as just a friendship. But in reality, it went much deeper. They lived together for a while, became emotionally attached to each other, and Cox was Brando's first real love. But this relationship had to remain secret because Brando's career was taken off. He had caused a sensation on Broadway playing Stanley Kowalski, and Hollywood was beginning to discover him. Brando's agents and studio representatives gave him a clear message: if you want to be a star, protect your image, be seen with women, get married, and never, ever let your private life leak out. By the time Brando moved to Hollywood in the early 1950s, he had already learned how to live a double life: a heterosexual, masculine star in front of the cameras by day, his true self behind closed doors at night. After his first major film, The Men, he made cinema history with A Streetcar Named Desire, and the role of Stanley Kowalski not only made him a star, but also turned him into an icon of masculinity. Stanley Kowalski was a raw, wild, testosterone-fueled character, and Brando played him so convincingly that the world believed he was like that in real life. This role was both a blessing and a curse for Brando. It launched his career, but also locked him into an image, because Marlon Brando was now synonymous with Stanley Kowalski, and a bisexual Stanley Kowalski was unacceptable. The Hollywood studio system controlled every aspect of actors' lives back then: who they could see, how they dressed, which parties they attended, and most importantly, who they dated. Studios routinely created fake relationships, paired gay actors with female actors, and leaked controlled stories to the press. Brando was part of this system, but he was smarter than most because he genuinely was attracted to women, which gave him the perfect cover. In the 1950s, he dated several high-profile women, actresses, models, socialites, and the press splashed each one across the headlines. In 1957, he married Anna Keshvi, and a year later his son, Christian, was born. This marriage was proof of Brando's heterosexuality, and the studios breathed a sigh of relief. But the marriage didn't even last a year, because Brando couldn't live suppressing his true self. And Anna was married to a man she didn't know. But the 1960s would change everything, because Brando would meet a man with whom he would truly feel free, James Dean. And that meeting would affect both their lives forever. The relationship between James Dean and Marlon Brando was one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets, because both were the brightest stars of the era, and a scandal could have ended both of them. Dean was young, rebellious, and desperately admired Brando. Brando was his idol, his method acting teacher, and Dean's efforts to meet him were legendary. When they finally met in 1954, Dean was 23, Brando was 30, and the attraction between them was instant. They both knew the other was living a secret life. They were both bisexual, and they were both under pressure from Hollywood. Their relationship was short but intense, because only a year had passed when Dean died in a car accident in 1955. But that year deeply affected Brando. Dean's death devastated Brando, because he had lost not just a lover, but someone who truly understood him. And Brando was not at the funeral, because his presence could have raised questions. After Dean's death, Brando became even more withdrawn and began to lead his secret life more carefully because he realized that this lifestyle was not only a career risk but also emotionally draining. Every relationship had to remain secret, every loved one could disappear, and his true self could never be fully lived. By the 1970s, America was undergoing a cultural revolution. The hippie movement, the sexual revolution, feminism, the Stonewall Uprising. And on the surface, society seemed more open. But the reality was much more complex because this freedom had not yet reached Hollywood. The film industry was still conservative, profit-driven, and unwilling to take risks because films cost millions of dollars to make. And to protect that investment, they needed to appeal to the broadest possible audience. Homosexuality and bisexuality were still career-ending scandals because the vast majority of the American public still did not accept them. And studios knew that if a star's sexual orientation became public knowledge, ticket sales would drop, investors would flee, and projects would be cancelled. So secrecy continued. Actors kept playing heterosexual roles. Studios kept controlling the press, and no one spoke out. Rock Hudson was the most tragic example of this because he was America's most popular romantic comedy star from the 1950s to the 1980s, the man of women's dreams, but in reality, he was gay and kept this secret until his death from AIDS in 1985. Hudson's story was the fate of all Hollywood stars living in secret, being caught, exposed, and watching their career end in a day. Tab Hunter lived a similar life, as did Anthony Perkins and countless others, all heterosexual by day, true to themselves by night. This lifestyle was not only exhausting, but also psychologically devastating, because constantly lying, constantly being on guard, and never being able to fully relax took a toll on one's mental health. Marlon Brando had lived in this system for 30 years and was now exhausted. He had 2 more marriages, more children, countless relationships with women that were public knowledge, but he felt empty because he couldn't live his true self. In 1974, Brando was 50 years old, and his career was in turmoil after the scandal of Last Tango in Paris. The film had made a big splash, but Brando was no longer Hollywood's darling. He had refused an Oscar, and the industry was keeping its distance from him. During that period, Brando spent more time at his mansion on Mulholland Drive, didn't go to parties, and became increasingly isolated. But that year, he received a party invitation at a producer's house in Beverly Hills, and although he would normally have declined, he accepted this time because he heard Richard Pryor would be there. Pryor was America's hottest stand-up comedian at the time. Wild, uncensored, and bold, saying things about race, society, and life that no one else dared to say. Brando had seen Pryor on television, was impressed by his style, and felt something, curiosity, attraction, and perhaps a sense of connection. When Brando arrived at the party, the room was packed. Hollywood's who's who was there, and Pryor was talking to a group of people in the corner, everyone laughing because Richard was telling a story. Brando watched from a distance and saw Pryor's energy, confidence, and that hidden sadness, because comedians were often the saddest people, and Brando knew this. A mutual friend introduced them, and the first encounter was ordinary. "Hello? I admire you, your work is great." But Brando saw something in Pryor's eyes, that familiar look, that understanding, and Pryor saw the same thing in Brando. They both knew this was no random meeting. That night, Brando and Pryor ended up talking for hours, and the conversation flowed from the superficial to the profound. First movies in comedy, then the philosophy of art, then the falseness of Hollywood, and finally, true self. Brando said something that caught Pryor's attention. It's impossible to be real in this industry. We're all acting, some on stage, some in life, and the heaviest masks are on the most famous faces. Pryor understood what he meant because he too wore a mask, he too hid, because Richard Pryor was also bisexual and couldn't tell anyone. Pryor seemed comfortable in comedy, saying anything on stage, but he never spoke about his sexual identity because he knew America wasn't ready, especially to accept a black comedian being bisexual. That night, an understanding was formed between Brando and Pryor, and they met again in the following weeks, first in public places with the group, then at private dinners, and finally, just the two of them at Brando's mansion. The relationship evolved naturally because they both needed it to be understood, accepted, and to have a space where they could take off their masks. When physical intimacy began, it was unsurprising but also dangerous because both were married, both were public figures, and a single photograph or witness could have ended everything. Brando and Pryor handled their relationship very carefully. They were never seen together romantically in public. Their meetings were always late at night at Brando's house, and no one outside their trusted circle of friends knew. Brando's Mulholland mansion was the perfect secret place because it was isolated, had a large estate, and provided privacy. On those nights, Brando and Pryor weren't just lovers. They were also therapy partners, friends, and each other's only true refuge. Brando told Pryor everything: his experiences with James Dean, his love for Wally Cox, how his split identity had worn him down, and how wearing the Hollywood mask had suffocated him for 50 years. Pryor shared, too, the traumas of his childhood growing up in a brothel in Peoria. His father's violence, his drug addiction, and his own struggle with sexual identity. They both realized they had experienced similar pain, the pressure of society, hiding their identities, and the chasm between their true selves and their performed selves. Their relationship lasted several years, and during that time, they both experienced the most honest moments of their lives because they could be completely themselves within those four walls. But the outside world carried on. Brando continued to be seen with other women. Pryor maintained his marriage, and the press remained unaware. The secrecy was so effective that no one knew for decades until Richard Pryor spoke on his deathbed. But ending their relationship was not easy because both men knew that it meant not just a breakup, but losing a part of their true selves. By the late 1970s, Brando and Pryor's relationship naturally ended because they were heading in different directions. Brando was becoming increasingly isolated, frequently traveling to Tahiti and distancing himself from Hollywood, while Pryor was at the peak of his career, making films, doing stand-up tours, and battling drug addiction. Their breakup wasn't dramatic. There was no fight or betrayal, just two people starting to walk different paths. But the bond between them never broke. They spoke on the phone occasionally, met up a couple more times over the years, but it wasn't the same because their lives had changed. In the 1980s, Pryor was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and the disease slowly began to consume him. First mild symptoms, then difficulty moving, then speech problems. Brando heard about Richard's condition from afar, but didn't reach out because he didn't know what to say. And perhaps he didn't want to reopen that old wound. In the 1990s, Brando was struggling with his own tragedies. His son Christian's murder trial, his daughter Cheyenne's suicide, and his own declining health. The two men never saw each other again for the rest of their lives. But they never forgot each other, because some bonds don't break. They just go quiet. Richard Pryor spent his final days at his home in Encino, and multiple sclerosis had weakened him so much that even breathing was difficult. The 65-year-old comedian lay in bed, his wife Jennifer Lee sitting beside him, and the doctors had said these could be his final hours. Pryor had battled the disease for 14 years, and now had no strength left. But there was something on his mind, something he needed to say, perhaps the most important secret of his life. Jennifer noticed a different look in Richard's eyes. Anguish, a burden, and a need to share. Richard tried to move his lips, but no sound came out. He tried again, and this time a very faint whisper emerged. Jennifer put her ear close to Richard's mouth because every word required effort. And Richard knew his time was limited. And then Richard spoke about Marlon, about Brando, and not just about friendship, but something deeper, a relationship, love. Jennifer froze because Richard had told her many things in his life, his addictions, his mistakes, his regrets. But this was different. This was a 50-year-old secret, and now it was coming out. Richard continued to whisper, and Jennifer listened quietly. He told her how he met Marlon, how they grew close in the 1970s, how special their relationship was, and why they couldn't tell anyone. There was so much pain in Richard's voice that Jennifer couldn't hold back her tears because she understood. Richard had carried this secret for 50 years, hiding a part of his true self, and now he wanted to set it free before he died. Richard also talked about others, the relationships he had with other men, how Hollywood silenced everyone, and most importantly, how exhausting the secrecy had been. When he finished speaking, Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Jennifer held his hand and said something. "Thank you for sharing. Your secret is safe with me." Richard smiled slightly, and that smile was one of his last emotional expressions because a few days later, on December 10th, 2005, Richard Pryor died. His funeral was attended by Hollywood's who's who. His comedian friends, movie stars, and fans. Everyone remembered Richard as a legendary comedian, but no one knew about that final confession. The Marlon Brando secret, because Jennifer hadn't shared it yet, and wouldn't share it for 13 years. For 13 years, Jennifer Lee Pryor kept her husband's final confession secret because she didn't know what to do. It wasn't just Richard's secret, it was also the secret of a dead man, Marlon Brando, and Jennifer wasn't sure if sharing it was the right thing to do. Brando had died in 2004, so neither man was alive anymore, but they had families, they had legacies, and Jennifer was afraid. How would people react? What would Brando's family do? Would Richard's legacy be damaged? But in February 2018, something happened that changed everything. Famous music producer Quincy Jones gave an interview to Vulture magazine and talked about Marlon Brando. Jones was very outspoken and said that Brando was bisexual, had been with many men, and that this was an open secret in Hollywood. Jones also named names: Richard Pryor, James Baldwin, and others. This interview exploded because Quincy Jones is a reliable source, a legend in the music industry, and wouldn't make such a claim lightly. Social media went wild. Newspapers ran headlines, and everyone asked the same question: is this true? Brando's family immediately denied it. Some Hollywood figures criticized Jones, and others defended him. Watching this news explosion unfold, Jennifer Lee made a decision. She could no longer remain silent because Richard had entrusted her with this truth, and Jones's statement had opened a door. A few days later, Jennifer gave an interview and confirmed it. Yes, Richard Pryor and Marlon Brando had had a relationship. Richard had confessed it on his deathbed, and it was a truth that had been hidden for 50 years. Jennifer also revealed that Richard was bisexual and had relationships with many men, but he couldn't say this publicly because at the time it would have meant career suicide. Jennifer's statement corroborated Quincy Jones's, and the media intensified. This was no longer just gossip, but a direct confession from Richard Pryor's wife. Some people were shocked because Brando and Pryor's public images were heterosexual, and both were masculine icons. Some celebrated because finally a truth had come out, and it was an important part of LGBTQ history. And some were angry because they questioned whether it was ethical to reveal the secrets of dead people. Jennifer defended her decision in the interview. It wasn't Richard's final wish, but after Jones's statement, she felt it was important to confirm the truth, because otherwise, Richard and Marlon's story would have remained mere speculation. Jennifer also emphasized that this story was not just a scandal, but also showed the trauma of an era, how bisexuality had to be hidden in the 1970s, how people lived double lives, and what the psychological cost of this pressure was. After Jennifer Lee's statement, the debate raged on for weeks, with various perspectives emerging. LGBTQ activists saw it as a victory, because Hollywood's hidden stories were finally coming to light. Conservatives criticized it because private life should remain private, and film historians re-evaluated Brando's life because they could now paint a more complete portrait. Some journalists investigated and found more evidence. Former Hollywood assistants and friends spoke up, some confirming that Brando's secret relationships were common knowledge, but no one talked about them. Some recounted his relationship with James Dean, and some recalled Wally Cox. This research showed that Brando's double life had lasted over 50 years, that he had relationships with many men, not just Pryor, and that he had managed to keep this fact hidden until his death. Some critics asked, why did Brando never come out? Why didn't he tell the truth before he died? The answer was complex, because in Brando's generation and era, it was impossible. It meant career ending, family shame, and social ostracism. Had Brando lived and been young today, he might have been able to live openly. But in America, between 1940 and 2000, it was not possible. Some LGBTQ advocates criticized Brando. Why didn't he use his voice? Why wasn't he an activist? Why did he choose secrecy? But this criticism was unfair because everyone has their own story, their own time, and their own limits, and pressuring Brando to be open was wrong. This is what remains about Marlon Brando. For 50 years, the biggest role he played was himself, the heterosexual masculine Hollywood star. This role was so convincing that the world believed it. The media wrote about it, and fans worshipped it. But the real Marlon Brando was more complex, more fragile, and more human. a man who loved both men and women, experienced an identity crisis, and never felt completely free. Richard Pryor lived a similar life and finally revealed that secret on his deathbed, perhaps because he wanted to tell the truth once before he died. This story isn't just a scandal about two celebrities, it's also a document of an era, Hollywood's dark side, and the impact of social pressure on individuals. Today, the situation is different. LGBTQ rights have advanced. Some actors live openly, and society is more accepting. But we must not forget the past because people like Brando and Pryor lived in the shadows so that future generations could walk in the sun. Their story is tragic, but also important because it reminds us that progress didn't come easily. It cost many lives, and the freedoms we have now were fought for. Marlon Brando lived two lives over 79 years, and his greatest performance wasn't Stanley Kowalski or Vito Corleone, but heterosexual Marlon Brando. And this performance was so perfect that for 50 years, no one noticed. But the truth eventually came out, because the truth always comes out sooner or later. And now we know Marlon Brando's full story, with its missing pieces, its contradictions, and all its humanity.